So then we are back with more understandings from the Renewed Covenant from the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of Israel from the time of the prophets of Yahweh, then giving us the understanding of the time of the end, so then at least we would have a chance of understanding the bearings of the world, so then we would be able to find the relationship with the heaven and the layer in the earth regarding then the prophecies of the end. As we understand from previous videos, we are precisely during the time of restoration, where then 2009 had ended the rulership of Satan in the earth in terms of the time of deceit, where then the divine was mixed with the Gentile work, and those then became separated forever. We are then during the time of restoration, and at the same time we are during the time of then reduction from 2031, because the Messiah then he spent time with the Samaritans in 4031 per the Creator's calendar. Then you also understand there were given then 2 days to the Samaritans. 2,000 years later you find in 6031. If you decide to use AD and BC, and this idea is very wrong because it's changing the times should remain as per the Creator's calendar. 4031. But then you can understand there are some tiny variations because the pagan calendar does not match with the Hebraic calendar. Then you can safely say the Messiah then spent time with the Samaritan when he was at the age of 32. Then from there you then can begin to understand 2,000 years later would give you then 2032. However, the Hebraic calendar is much more precise than the pagan. So then, understanding from the time of the Messiah when he was then born in 3999, because the age of the earth in terms of then the birth of a person is then the age of 7,000 years. But we understand there are some tiny variations where then you find the bulk of the understanding of the time period in the earth reaching its 7,000. And then during this time we must understand then the prophecies and what they mean. So then from the time he spent with the Samaritans, 4031, 2,000 years later makes 6031. As you understand, from the time when the time begins to count, you don't count as 0 as we do then in pagan understanding. When you are born, you already have a year old. You are a year old. Okay, so when the earth started, then in terms of people in the earth, already started in the first 1,000 years. So then it started making sense. So then 6031 is the maximum time. Then when you reduce, you begin to reduce the time then from 6031 up to our time is 6012. However, from 6009, then you begin to understand what it means, then the reduction of time from 6031 and then the restoration at the same time. So then you begin to understand what those areas are. In any place you indicate where then the Messiah was born, because it's not the factor of coming up with 1,000 years after or 1,000 years earlier. It is not the point. Because understanding of the time ending of prophecies, you have to understand when the great star of Bethlehem then showed up in the sky. And we find these revelation then in 3999. So then the Messiah then afterwards, obviously he was born, and then in 4031, or then let's say if it was then 0, if we start with 0, Okay? 31 years later, he spent time then with the Samaritans, or then 32. If you want to start with 0, because as he was born, it was already the number 1. But let's say you want to start with 0, because then pagan understanding with the pagan numbers starts with 0, then it would be 32. Okay? So then he spent 2 days with them, indicating 2,000 years. 2,000 years later, after 32, what does it come up with? 2032. So then if you then calculate these with the Creator's calendar, then gives you the understanding of it. So we are in fact living during the time of the end. Time of the end. We are coming towards then the autumn feast. So then from the understanding of the Messiah then coming in 3999, then you find himself then spending time with the Samaritans 4031. "2,000 years later, 6031. So there is a tiny variation from understanding from the Creator's view in terms of his calendar, or then the pagan calendar. But the factor of the situation is when the time in the earth started, already started with the number 1. But then when you evaluate the Creator's calendar, you have to understand then the time truly began when the Messiah was born. And we have the solid understanding that the Messiah then was born then more than 2,000 years before. We understand this factor very thoroughly. So then I begin to understand what it means. 3999. So then, the very factor he was born during this time, he was already born as king and priest. So he came, then he brought the first anointing for the second tabernacle services. His father was in charge of the tabernacle in the desert, in the Holy of Holies. Then his turn would come, where then his anointing would be in the Holy of Holies of the second tabernacle services. His people then were in charge for 1,000 years. Then in 1009, the most important event was the destruction of the city and the tomb. Satan the destroyer had to put him in prison because there were no more cities for him to persecute. His facet of the city had taken over. So from 1009 to 2009, then you find 1,000 years. A time of the mixture of Gentile works and then heaven, what they thought of was heaven. Didn't work. So return to the truth. So back to the cities. As then we came out of 2009, then the time of restoration had started, and the reduction at the same time found in Matthew the 24th chapter. So then it started making sense. Because if you evaluate in the Creator's calendar as per the first 1,000, from the time people were in the earth, started obviously with Adam, and indications then has shown us that the earth is much older. However, understanding heaven and its intricacies related with the Torah, the prophets, and then what heaven has for us prophecy-wise, we are not interested if the earth was older. We are interested from the time people then were placed in the earth. Then start counting the time, because the time counted obviously because of the plan of salvation. That's why then the time was counted. So from the time then you begin to count the numbers, you have to count already with 1,000. So truly the understanding then, from the time that you begin to understand Hebraic culture, and then when you are born, you already have a number 1 year old. So if you understand with the same understanding as per the Creator's calendar, would have a similitude, giving the indication that our then age would end around 7,000 years. So then you can make the proper adjustment if you decide. However, we find the star of Bethlehem. So then rather than playing around with numbers, we understand the reference point as per the birth of the Messiah. And the star of Bethlehem was recorded. Then you place the information in the computer, then you find the eclipses around it, and then you determine when he was born. We understand he was born 2,000 years ago, roughly. He spent time with the Samaritans in a regular calendar of the Creator's calendar would be 4031. Regular calendar, he spent time with the Samaritans 32. Concerning he was born, then the time, and then the time then it started. Because from prophetic viewpoint, it's not from Israel's viewpoint. There are other starting of other calendars based upon the last king Israel had. It's not important. The most important is understanding the tabernacle services, because the Messiah came to restart then what was started earlier, the returning of the tabernacles. So then from the time of the Messiah, then you begin to count prophetic time. The pagans of the time, they got confused and they changed even the time itself. It was wrong. Prophetic time. So then he was born, you count then 32. He was put on a pole a year later. Then 32 he spent time with the Samaritans. 2,000 years gives you then 2032. So then from our time 6012 the original calendar, or you can say 2012, then 2032 gives us the time that we have available. Gives us around 20 years. Maximum of 22. Very, very, very maximum if you begin to understand it. Then some tiny understandings from a calendar to another calendar. And then there are some tiny distinctions from a calendar to calendar. So give and take 22 years maximum. If you understand the Creator's calendar, per the time of then the barley aviv and so on and so forth, the computer calculates, you find 39.99. Then you have to consider then the fact of then when people were in the earth, they already started with the first 1,000. But for sure we understand the reference point is 39.99 per the Creator's calendar, or 0 when then the Messiah was born. In 32 he spent time with the Samaritans. Gave them 2 days, couple thousand years. 2032 is the maximum. So because of those tiny variations, then you begin to understand. But the most important factor is the Messiah coming 2,000 years before. That's where we get our bearings from. He gives us then no more than 22 years. Because understanding from the position of the Gentile calendar, if you calculate from the time of the creation, you have to start with 1,000. Because the same principle when starts within a person starts living. When you were born, you are a year old. Came from the culture. Obviously, then the Creator's calendar was then created the same way. So understanding this factor, then we understand we are now already coming very close to the seventh. Seventh meaning the end, because we already entered the seventh. But then you don't count as number precise, you have to count as per prophecies being completed. So then you have 2,000 years of rulership of the Gentiles. Then you have the prophecies on top of it. And there is a transitional time. For how long the nation of Israel had to transition themselves from the first service and the second service. Truly the second service started when Yohanan was in the holy city. Then you understand then the total completion of the transitional time. Around 100 years. So understanding from the Hebraic calendar, taking away the pagan understanding, we already have the seventh 1,000. But then there are some give and take there. It's not precisely as then is spoken, because it's spoken via prophecies and the completions thereof. So you find the city of Jerusalem being destroyed in 1009. Not precisely at 1,000. So you have to begin to understand the principles. So per the Creator's calendar, as then taking away the calculation with the pagan mind, you find then we already have reached the 7,000. Because when the calendar started, was already 1,000. So it makes sense, but the point is not playing around with these numbers. It's understanding when the star had shown up in heaven. And this factor was recorded and then calculated. So then, per the Creator's calendar, without the interference with Gentile calculation, then you find 5031 rather than 4031, because of that's how they read the calendar. But for us, does not change the situation, because our reference of this is the Star of Bethlehem. So either you understand 4031 and then 6031 as being then as per pagan counting of 7 of 1,000, or you can count at 6 of 1,000 starting with 0. Or we can do these with AD and BC and then ends up in 2032. The reason why you can do these shiftings, understanding the context, is because the reference point is then the start of Bethlehem. Then the Messiah, 32 years later, he spent time with Samaritans, gave them 2 days, 1,000 each, 2,000. So we have maximum of 22 years without the reduction. Because then when you read Metichiahu, the 24th chapter, then you read, then because of the situation in the future, that time would be reduced for the sake of the elect. So then his people, after the coming out of the time of the seat, would return to their holy services. Thus the return of the cities. But the only way we can determine this precisely is because we have the reference point in heaven came down when the star of Bethlehem had shown up. It was a divine guidance from heaven in the physical form of a star, indicating a precision of the time period. So then, if any other calculation was wrong, the star of Bethlehem would be shown in a certain time. So maximum of, let's say, 2032 without a reduction. So there is not much time because we don't know for how long then the reduction is going to be. We know for sure the first 1,000 is already gone. The second 1,000 is already gone. We don't know for how long the reduction is going to be, but there is a reduction. And the restoration is taking place, where the nations are going to be starting rebuilding. In Europe, the era is going to break in very front of your very eyes, so then we can understand what Daniel said is true. So then what the Messiah then indicated via his servant then Yohanan when he saw then Revelation the 8th chapter. What would be the wisest step we can ever take as a nation other than being very strong friends with China? It's extremely important because we have the answer already of the nation leading the market at the end. So then we understand also there is a computerized system coming up. The best for us is making very strong partnership with China and then rebuild our country and delegate as much as we can in terms of themselves doing patrols, because then we can rebuild. So then the whole scripture is starting making more sense, and as then time goes on, more of information is going to come up. But then we understand the first city is in the land of Cush because of the prophecy. And the Messiah did speak of the returning of the cities. But we find the information on the other 90% not included. Because the Messiah was hated so much, the other Megillas were burned and destroyed. But the prophecy gives you then tabernacling outside of the holy perimeter of Israel. And then the returning of the cities, then you find a location. Because as we understand, you don't have a chronological number in terms of facts of events. It does not mean chapter 1:8 is then before 61st. You have to understand the context. That's why I have to understanding layers of understanding. Depending on a topic, you find parts of it at the end. Depending on a topic, you find at the first. As per the development of the prophecies, then you direct yourself. Timeline. So the restoration is spoken of in the 61st relates with chapter 1:8 in content. The city returning. That's why then Shaul said in terms of times and seasons, you don't have to be then educated. He doesn't have to write to them regarding times and seasons. Times and seasons. We understand of a season. Season of time. So 61st chapter speaks of the restoration of the cities laid waste for centuries. Then the city Jerusalem. Then the temple rebuilt. With the same line of understanding you find in Yeshayahu 1:8. But then when you understand the context, what Yahweh then is explaining in the prophecy, then you understand the link. Tabernacling. This word is extremely specific only for the presence of Yahweh in a tabernacle. They don't have any other translation for this word. How are you going to have a tabernacle outside of the Holy Land of Israel? It's lunacy. However, the Messiah said, go therefore around the world and form tabernacles. Then you find a place, tabernacling, outside of the holy nation of Israel. What do you understand? It's a city. It's the returning of the city, or the cities. You have to understand the context of the entire situation, but then you don't understand as 61st chapter and then 1/8 chapter, or then the 5th chapter, or then 20th chapter. Does not have chapter. It is by times and seasons. That's why the Greco and the Romans, when they translated the scripture, they did not know what to do with them. They were trying to place the information in a chronological understanding, but they couldn't make anything out of it. You don't place information layered in pages. You have to leave them in Megillas. That's why they were in Megillas. You have to write a portion of it and then place aside. You write then the other portion of it and you place aside. You have to write the other portion of it and then you lay it aside. And then as the layers they come, you get those Megillas related with the layer he's speaking of. Then makes sense. However, if you place them in a flat surface, then you solde them together, that makes no sense. So the 61st chapter is then linked in the same layer as 1/8. Only related with the portion of the cities. Then parts of the prophecy relates with the time where then this particular prophecy was spoken of in a particular understanding of the political understanding of the country. Much later there were other developments. Understanding prophecy is not very easy. There are certain words only used in Hebrew, certain words only used in English, and then you have to understand on that day or when the day comes. Meaning then you have to have a shift in your mind to understand what he's speaking of, and he's preparing the people for the autumn feast. Found in Leviticus the 23rd chapter, from the 23rd verse through the 44th. On that day, when the day comes, in the day of Yahweh, or in the day of the Messiah. Those are references of the autumn feast. And then you have to understand the timeline from the time of Leviticus. Then you have to understand there is a layer that extends up to then Revelation. From there, when you read then the layers related with this line, then certain parts of a certain prophecies spoken of by the prophet links with other areas spoken by other prophets in another time. However, they speak of the same topic. Thus understanding in layers. As far as the timing, don't be concerned with it. As long as we have the record from the start of Bethlehem, then we understand. 32 years later, then the Messiah spoke with the Samaritans. If you are a person who extremely want to be precision, then you have to understand. He started in the first time that he was born, then number 1. Then you can say a year later, then he spent time with the Samaritans. Only because there is a day later in terms of time of 24 hours does not mean that he's given another 1,000 years. Come on. Then you have to understand the context. He gave them 2 days. The days of the Messiah meaning 1,000 each. If it was done 24 hours before or 24 hours after, or the year earlier of his time on the earth, or then a year later in his time of the earth, then does not count. What counts is 2 days given. That's your reference point there. 2,000 years later makes 2031 if you read then from the Creator's calendar from 4031. If you start then the calendar as if then you would start as the Creator started at 1,000 already when it started, when there were people in the earth, then you have to understand is then 7,000. Does it make sense? So then we are in 7012 because we are coming to the end. Or you can read as per pagan and start then with 0 and then comes to 6012. But then does not change the fact of the start of Bethlehem showing up around 2,000 years ago. It never changes. And we know for sure it's more than 2,000 years. So then the time is very short. There is not much time. We already entered the time of restoration and the reduction. Because in 1009 we already have recorded also there was the destruction of Jerusalem and the Holy Tomb. So it gives you then the indication of Satan did not have anything else to destroy in any other city. He went to prison. That's our first understanding of the pit. Later he's released from the pit because cities are going to be around. So please don't be caught up with dates and time. Only understand 3999, understand the Messiah was born. If you then start with 0. If you do it by then the Hebraic calendar starting with 1,000, then it's 1,000 years later. But that doesn't change the fact of then the stars showing up 2,000 years ago. You have these points solidly there. Never changes. And you have then 1,000 years later when then the city of Jerusalem and the tomb was destroyed. That's our first 1,000. Prior of this time, the cities were around, Satan were destroying them, and then when it came into 1009, no more cities. He went to prison. His facet of a destroyer. This city had taken over. 1,000 years of deceit. 2009 ends the deceit. We are back into the truth. These are facts that can't be changed. Your analogy of time and number can be flexible. As long as you never change 3999, neither understanding then the time of the 1009 when the city was destroyed and the tomb. It can be 3999 if you read from 0. Or 4999 if we start then with 1,000. But doesn't change the context of then the timeline when the Messiah spent time with the Samaritans. It doesn't change. Because the most important event of the start of Bethlehem was recorded. Then you have the other recording of the destruction of Jerusalem and the tomb. It was the first destruction recorded where then even the tomb was destroyed. It was a persecution of faith during the time. So the time is truly very short. Please stay tuned, much more coming up. Because then later, we're going to make more calculations and verify what are those numbers, time and a half a time, and another half, and those must land at the time period of 490 days then given for the completion of the second portion of the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, named then the autumn feast. So then when you have then those, in quote, milestones of his birth, the start of Bethlehem, you have then 1009, the destruction of the tomb and the city. Then you have 1,000 years later, then the ruling given to Satan. Then we are returning to the truth. That's why the world is so out of whack. Because it's pointing back to the holy cities for directives. And the knowledge has increased, and people are more confused than ever. Then comes the reduction of time and the time of restoration. The indicators of the time period is absolutely perfect. How you then placed your numbers then is up to you. You can do absolutely per then the Creator's calendar, counting as He counted. The first 1,000, when the people were in the earth, it started with 1,000, and then 2,000, and so on and so forth until the 7,000. We are in the 7,000. Because it was counted as 0, started with 1. If you count then the normal, you count then with 0. Then we are in 6012. But doesn't change then the showing of the star of Bethlehem, indicating his birth. 32 years later, he spent time with the Samaritans. Then you get your 2000. Because Yahweh has placed the stars and the lunar view and the sun for times and seasons. So we get our bearings from times and seasons. Before our numbers get screwed up, we go to the heavens. When the first star then of Bethlehem came in this time. It was recorded. We understand then it was the only astronomical event most important in the entire history of this planet, indicating his birth. 32 years later, then he spent time with the Samaritans. Please stay tuned, much more coming up.